Welcome everyone to Gerhardt Center webinar series. We're having today David Stroh, and the title of the topic of the webinar series is on this webinar is Systems Thinking for Social Change. And the thrust of today's webinar will be a talk by David Stroh. And the theme would be how can we learn to work with underlying forces in a complex social system, such as in Egypt, or anywhere in the world, actually, in a complex social system to improve our to improve its performance, the system performance, in sustainable ways. So actually, the webinar is going to be looking at complex social systems and addressing it from a systems thinking point of view, and the target is to solve these challenges in a social system in a sustainable way. And examples will be drawn from real-life projects such as homelessness, reducing poverty and stagnation, and increasing equitable access to education and healthcare, and mitigating climate change. I would like to, first of all, thank you for accepting me as moderator for this talk. David Peter Stroh is an international expert in applied systems thinking. He is the author of the best-selling book, Systems Thinking for Social Change, a practical guide for solving complex problems, avoiding unintended consequences, and achieving lasting results. He has a career spanning 40 years, and his clients had included Unilever, World Bank, Kellogg Foundation, and Open Society Foundation, among others. He is the founding partner of Bridgeway Partners, which has the motive, change the systems to change the world. And he is coined as the magician of applied systems thinking. So that's looking forward for an exciting talk. So without much ado, David, the floor is yours. So we'll have like 25 minutes or so to present the webinar, and then we'll have some comments and questions after that.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Tarek. So it's a pleasure to be here. And I'd love to begin just by finding out a little bit more about who you are. So the first, we'll do several polls to introduce ourselves. The first is, what do we do? Are you primarily an executive or manager? Or 2, a consultant or coach? 3, an educator? Or do you have some other primary role? So there's the poll. Please answer. And just to get an idea of who we are, who's participating today. Okay, well, it seems to be winding down. So it's interesting, educators, and there's a large other category. If a few of you could just quickly put in the chat what is in the other category, it would be helpful to know that. And Tarek, maybe you will see some themes in those other.
Sure. You can jot a student. We have one for students.
Students, yes.
It's part of the educational system, but also have another student, a third student. Okay.
Okay. Very good. Thank you. And secondly, I'm going to move to the second poll here. Thank you very much. And that is, where are you from? From the Middle East, from Asia, Europe, Africa, the Americas, or some other part of the world. So if you would quickly answer the second poll, we'll get an idea of where you're from.
Can they choose more than one, David, or is it only Middle East or Africa? Because Egypt is in both Africa and Middle East.
Ah, well, that is a challenge. That's a very good point. So
Maybe we should add both the percentages and see.
Okay, well, that is a very good point. I always thought of Turkey as being in Europe and Asia, but very true. Egypt is physically in the middle, in Africa, North Africa. Okay, well, thank you. So most of you from the Middle East, I'm going to assume a lot from Egypt, and quite well distributed from around the world. Thank you very much. So even though have different roles and we're from somewhat different parts of the world, the fact of the matter is, that we're all in the same boat. And for some of us, we may feel a little drier than others, a little safer than others. But the fact of the matter is this boat is not very sustainable. And the people on top, even though they think they're fine, are not going to be dry for that much longer. So we need to help people understand how they're part of the same boat, what kind of boat they're in, and most importantly, then how to redesign the boat to work for more people. The goals of the webinar then are to, first of all, understand why it's so hard to redesign this boat. Why our good intentions to make change are not enough. Secondly, to distinguish systems from conventional thinking, to learn a basic tool for systems thinking, and to introduce a 4-stage process for leading systemic change. In terms of good intentions, here are some sample news headlines. These are all based on true stories. Homeless shelters perpetuate homelessness. Food aid leads to increased starvation. Drug busts increase drug-related crime. Agricultural pesticides reduce soil quality. And even job training programs increase unemployment. Now, what is going on here? What do these stories have in common? So I'd like you to just take a moment, and if you have something to write on, take some notes or just think about what do these stories have in common. And then I'm going to share some findings from our understanding of complex social systems from many other people who participated in a similar exercise.
Some says, some are comments saying it backfires. Another comment is it has reverse effects. And I can add also it's not enough to have good intentions, I guess.
All true. All true. Thank you. Yes, so it's not enough to have good intentions because this is the way systems often respond to our efforts to improve them. First of all, we have a tendency to address symptoms versus underlying problems. Why are people homeless? Why are there so many pests in the soil in the first place? Why is there so much drug-related crime? So we don't get to the underlying problems. What we do actually often works in the short run. One of the reasons we keep doing what we do is because in the short term, if you build a homeless shelter, fewer people, at least temporarily, will be homeless. If you send food to people who are starving in a country, temporarily they will have more food. At some level, this is sort of logical and obvious for us to do this. However, those short-term gains are undermined by longer-term impacts. And those longer-term impacts are negative, often, not all the time, sometimes they're positive. They're often negative. They're not intentional. Most people are not trying to do the wrong thing. And finally, if the problem recurs, we don't see our responsibility for the problem. We know how we're part of the solution or want to be part of the solution, but we often don't see how we're part of the problem. Good intentions are not enough. When you are confronted by any complex social system with things about it that you're dissatisfied with and anxious to fix, you cannot just step in and set about fixing with much hope of helping. This is one of the sore discouragements of our time. And this is a quote from Lewis Thomas, who was president of the Sloan Kettering Cancer Institute, dean of the Yale and New York University Medical Schools. He knows a lot about complex systems. Now, he also says if you want to fix something, you're first obliged to understand the whole system. Now, I would say that it is actually impossible to understand whole systems because ultimately they're too complex. At the same time, we can gain a meaningful understanding of significant parts of the system such that we can make a sustainable improvement in that system's performance. And that's what we're aiming for. Not complexion, not completeness, not entire understanding, but sufficient understanding to make a significant difference. In order to do that, we need to understand the difference between systems thinking and conventional thinking. And it will be helpful to have some definitions to do that. One, when I talk about the word system, I mean use an interconnected set of elements that is coherently organized in a way that achieves something. Now, this is a quote from Donella Meadows, who was one of the best known, most highly respected systems thinkers that we have had. And notice that last word, something. You would think that an expert in systems thinking could come up with a better word than at the end, something. But that word is actually very significant because systems are always designed to achieve what they are achieving right now. Even though they may appear dysfunctional, there is actually some underlying organizing direction, goal, purpose that system is actually achieving. And what systems thinking is then about is the ability to understand these interconnections in such a way as to achieve a desired purpose, not the purpose that the system is currently achieving, but some other purpose that we want it to achieve. And that distinction between what the system is actually achieving and what we want it to achieve is a very important distinction. So we need to learn to appreciate systems thinking and how it is different from conventional thinking. Conventional thinking is what we typically learn in school. It's linear thinking, it's breaking the world into finer and finer parts, and then hopefully trying to pool our understanding of all these detailed parts and bring them back together. But that type of thinking is actually not very effective when it comes to trying to change complex systems. I will also say that systems thinking, even though it sounds very esoteric, very abstract, very technical, in many ways is actually very obvious. So if you imagine when you had kids, if you've had them, and you found yourself picking up after your children time and time again, and then you think, wait a second, why do I keep picking up after them? I want them to pick up after themselves, after all. But what you discover is the reason that you're picking up after them is because you get impatient and they realize that they can wait you out. There is a time delay in the system. So if they can wait you out, you get impatient enough, you will finally pick up their clothes instead of them. Children actually are very natural systems thinkers, and we tend to get those insights about the world educated out of us, when in fact, instinctively, we understand a lot about them, even at a very early age. So one of the aspects, one of the characteristics of conventional thinking is that problems and causes are obviously connected. If the problem is homelessness, then we just need to put a roof over people's heads. If the problem is pests in the soil, we just need to add pesticide to kill the pests. But in fact, in systems thinking, problems and their underlying causes are not obviously connected. Another distinction is that when things don't work, conventionally, our reaction is to look for others to blame. We're doing the best we can. We are contributing to the system. It's others who are getting in our way. But in systems thinking, we start with the assumption that we're not just part of the solution, but we are also part of the problem. And this is a very important mindset to cultivate. And the reason it's so important is that ultimately the greatest control you have over the system begins with your own intentions, your own thinking, and your own behavior. So you need to start with yourself, and then naturally other parts of the system you'll be more able to affect. But we need to start with that mindset that we're part of the problem, not just part of the solution. It's actually an empowering point of view. In conventional thinking, if something works in the short term, it means it will automatically work in the long term as well. But in systems thinking, we understand that most quick fixes make no difference in the long term or actually make matters worse. In conventional thinking, if we're trying to improve the performance of a system, we try to optimize each part separately. So for example, in an organization, each department has its own metrics, and each department tries to optimize its own individual metrics. But what we know about systems and how they improve is not by improving each part separately, but by improving the relationships among the parts of the system. And finally, what do we think about in terms of interventions? When there's so many symptoms, when so many things are broken, the natural reaction is to try to do as much as we can, as quickly as we can, to improve the situation. But in fact, systems do not improve that way. They improve through identifying a few key coordinated changes or leverage areas that are then sustained over time. Systems change takes time. It requires targeting our efforts in a few areas and coordinating those efforts and staying the course over a long period of time. So this is sort of the ultimate systems thinking cartoon. Here we have the expert problem solver, and they are very good at getting their problem solved in their immediate part of the system. But the consequences of their solution are often that there is a ripple effect, a set of signals that are sent through the larger system, and that larger system can include other groups within that person's own organization. It can include other organizations in the same sector. It can include other sectors, customers, suppliers, however you define this, until ultimately that last domino is going to fall. And there are two possibilities when that last domino falls. One is the person is still in the chair and the domino falls on them. Or very often that person is no longer in the chair because they are so good at solving their part of the problem. Not are they only in the chair, but they've actually been promoted because they're so good at solving immediate problems. And of course, this person has no idea of what's going on. They're facing away from the dynamics that they have created. So instead of blaming this last domino for falling on their head, if they turned around, they might be able to see that in fact that last domino is falling on their head because of something that they initiated, and they have control over changing their intentions, their thinking, and their behavior. How many of you believe in the power of visionary leadership? That leaders need to have a strong vision. Now, I certainly believe that. But that has its limitations. As important as it is, there are limits to visionary leadership by itself. I've got it too, Omar, a strange feeling like we've just been going in circles. So here we have visionary leaders. They're facing out to the horizon. That's what they should do. They should look ahead to see the possibilities out on the horizon. But they're missing an important element. They are not seeing the nature of the structure that they are trying to impact. So it's not enough for a visionary leadership to just look out at the vision, at the possibilities. They also need to understand, and if necessary, redesign the structure of the system that they are leading so that it will, in this case, go straight rather than go in long circles over time. One of the tools, the most basic tools we have to understand this system structure is what we call the iceberg. And the reason we talk about an iceberg is because the most powerful part of that iceberg is hidden. 90% of an iceberg is underwater where we can't see it, but that is the part that can do the greatest damage. So how do we understand the iceberg as a way of seeing different levels of reality? First of all, the top of the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg, the part that is most obvious are the events, things that happen at particular points in time that draw our attention. But if we only see the world in terms of events, all we can do is to react or fight a fire, to deal with the immediate crisis or try to put out the fire when we see it. However, if we step back from events, we often see that these events are not isolated from each other. They're actually part of an ongoing pattern. of change over time. And if we understand trends or patterns, then we can try to anticipate or forecast what is going to happen in the future and position ourselves accordingly. But we also know that forecasts can be terribly wrong, that depending on forecasts is not a very powerful way of moving forward, and particularly if those trends are moving in an undesirable direction. So if we want to go deeper still to understand what is going on, we need to recognize the power of systems structure, the underlying forces and pressures at play in the system. Things like policies, processes, power dynamics, perceptions, or mental models, beliefs, assumptions, and that question of purpose. What is that system ultimately designed to accomplish? The reason for understanding system structure is that this is where we can make change. And this is where we can create sustainable change and improvement into the future, because the system structure shapes the trends and patterns, which in turn create the trends that we see most obviously. And in order to access these different levels, we need to ask different questions. When we're trying to understand events, we ask what happened at a particular point in time. When we want to understand trends and patterns, we should ask what has been happening over time. And finally, to understand system structure, that area where leverage exists, we need to ask why. Why do these trends and patterns keep occurring? Why do these events keep occurring? So ultimately, our interest in going to the bottom of this iceberg is to learn better what we are dealing with and have greater leverage in making sustainable improvements. So I'm going to give you an example. Here are some critical events from this past year. Most extreme heat wave in world history. The summer monsoon flooding in India cost nearly 1,300 lives. European summer floods were the costliest weather disaster in European history ever. And the cold wave in the central United States was the second costliest winter weather disaster in world history. These are events from the past year. Now I'm going to look at this question of trends and patterns. I'm going to use a very specific teaching example first. So imagine a lily pond. And what we know about the lily pond is that 100% of the surface area of the pond is covered in 30 days. And the other fact that we know is that the surface area covered by lily pads doubles every day. So I'm going to ask you two questions, and now we'll put up the next poll. And the first poll will be, when is the pond half full? Is it at the end of 10 days, 15 days, 22 days, or 29 days? So Tarek, if you would, or whoever is in charge of polls, if you would put up poll number 3, give people an opportunity to answer. Hello? Is there anyone there?
yeah, I'm here, but I'm trying to. Can you please help us with the poll, please? I don't see the poll.
Okay, well, if necessary, mentally make a note of your answer to that question. When is the pond half full? And those are your choices. Okay.
All right.
So if everybody has given an answer, then we'll move to the next one. Okay. So here is the next question. How full is the pond after 15 days, which is halfway through the month? Is it 75% full, 50% full, 25% full, or 0.0025% full? So again, make a mental note or write it down, your answer. Okay, here we go. Quickly. So poll number 3, when is the pond half full? And we have actually, okay, keep coming here. And we'll just give it a little more time. Okay, well, we'll stop it here because we want to make sure we have enough time to cover the rest. So the majority actually thought it would be halfway through the month, 15 days. And then interestingly, the second largest number of votes, highest number of votes, was 29 days, 1 day before the pond is entirely full. And actually, that is the correct answer, is 29 days. Why? Because the pond is doubling its surface area of lilies every day, which means that the day before the pond is entirely full, it's actually half full. Because in that last day, it will go from being 50% full to 100% full. Now that's not an obvious answer, but in fact, it's the right one. And let's quickly look at poll number 4. We can get it up there. Oh, did I miss it? Did I, does everybody see poll number 4?
Yeah, they are. Yeah, we are.
Okay, I turned mine off by mistake, so you'll have to report the results. Sorry.
That's okay. Or I think we have a stable answer. I think the majority say 0.0025, that's 60%, and 20% say 50%, and 15% of respondents say 25%, and only 5% say 75%. So the majority, 60%, say number 4, 0.0025.
Okay, well, those of you who said 0.0025%, you have excellent engineering calculators, and that is the correct answer. You don't practically see any lilies in the pond halfway through the month. So what is the nature of this curve, this trend that we're talking about? So 30%, at 30 days, it's 100% full. At 29 days, it's 50% full. At 28 days, it's 1/4 full, and so on. So this is the trend or pattern for exponential growth with a doubling function. Day 29, the day before the pond is fully covered, it's half covered, and it's almost invisible at the end of just half of the month. So an important lesson here is that you cannot simply predict the future based on trends. In fact, you can be very, very mistaken about what will happen in the future if you try to derive it from a trend line without understanding what produces that trend in the first place. Here is a curve of global CO2 emissions from the year 1751 to the year 2013. A very similar curve. You'll see it's practically flat until about 1870, still hardly anything happening until 1950, and it's only in the past 70 or so years that we have seen this explosive exponential growth in global CO2 emissions. Notice when people were arguing for many years about, is the world warming? Is that a significant trend? Is it a noticeable trend? If you only look at the trend lines for a short period of time, you may not even see the significance of what is happening and the seriousness of it. And we're now saying we're at a tipping point because that curve has suddenly gone sharply higher. It helps to understand the nature of the structures in society, in nature particularly, that are being produced by fossil fuel emissions. For example, fossil fuel emissions increases the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, which increases the number of global greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which increases global temperature, which increases soil and the ocean release of CO2, which further increases greenhouse gases. It reduces forests, which reduces the ability of our Earth to sequester, to absorb CO2, which further increases CO2 in the atmosphere. There are various structures, vicious cycles that are released in terms of melting of the polar ice caps. I won't go into all of this, but nonetheless, what this is indicating from a structural point of view, there are many, many vicious cycles that are produced by fossil fuel emissions that cannot be simply understood or communicated by looking at time trends. And of course, these dynamics, these vicious circles, have their own impacts on food insecurity, on refugee crises, and so on. So understand the structure. I'm going to close for just a few minutes to talk about a model, a four-stage process for leading systems change, using, among other things, the principles and tools of systems thinking. I'm going to start off by introducing a dynamic called creative tension. If you want to change anything, you need to establish a tension, a discrepancy between what you want, what are the desired results or outcomes, and a clear, honest picture of where you are, current reality, what you have, both what works about current reality, what's positive about it, as well as what's negative. And when you establish that discrepancy, you create something called creative tension. And I'll just quickly show you what I mean. So here is a rubber band, and this rubber band is tense. This is what I want, this is where I am, and this tension naturally seeks resolution. And the principle is the more that you can hold this tension, keep telling the truth about what you want, and simultaneously keep telling the truth about where you are, the more that tension is likely to resolve in favor of what you want to create. So how does this
David, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we're really out of time. Is there a possibility we finish in 1 or 2 minutes? We would
Yes,
like to have
I will.
discussion and comments.
Yes.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
So thank you. And I was intending to do that. In this creative tension model, actually, the most important and neglected part of the work is in understanding reality. You know, our mental energy is consumed by the complexity of reality. So a large part of this work is helping people get clearer about reality, get clearer, develop shared pictures of the underlying system structure at the bottom of that iceberg. So there are 4 stages to this change process. The first one, building a foundation for change, engaging stakeholders, building collaborative capacity. Secondly, very importantly, helping those stakeholders develop a shared understanding of the system structure and their own responsibility for creating it. The third is to help people make an explicit choice, a choice between the case for change, what they envision, what they want, and very importantly, to recognize the case for the status quo. What is the system designed to achieve now? And sometimes you need to make a choice between those two. You can't necessarily have both all the benefits of the status quo and the change that you say you want to achieve. And finally, if you can make this commitment to the changes that you are talking about, you can talk about bridging the gap by creating short-term momentum within a long-term context and establishing structures for continuous learning. And with that, I'll just offer you some resources that you can follow up with and then turn it back to you folks. So we'll have a good 15 minutes or so for questions and answers. This is the book that Tarek introduced at the beginning, Systems Thinking for Social Change, available among other places on Amazon. The Bridgeway Partners website, another website I've created with a colleague, a resource website called AppliedSystemsThinking.com, and this is the homepage on the right. And finally, a way to reach me through my email. So with that, I'd love to hear from you and offer whatever additional comments I can. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really would like to, I would really like to thank David Stroh for such an interesting talk about systems thinking for social change. I have some comments and maybe some feedback on the methodology, and also some maybe some thoughts, and maybe I can have 1 or 2 questions. And also, of course, that we are open for questions. You can put your questions, by the way, in the chat box, and we'll take maybe a couple of questions at the end. If you want to share using your audio or video on as well, you will be free to do so. So just several comments. David looked at systems thinking for social change, and I guess that he had a beautiful interpretation about the contrast between reality and objectives, or basically the contrast between reality and target, and the gap between them, and how to create a creative tension such that we minimize this gap. It's a very interesting way. I just have several comments first, on the technical part of systems thinking, I think if anyone of you is interested, there are different techniques for systems thinking. A very recent technique is by MIT, which is the MBSE technique, which is model-based systems thinking. And it looks at basically system structure versus relationship behavior. And David touched upon the importance of relationships and behavior, and then requirements or resource constraints, which are very, very fundamentally important. Also, there is Caltech's PMTE, Process Method Tool Environment, method of systems thinking. And there are also, for those who are interested, there is also systems thinking softwares, computer softwares, and one of which, the most famous, I believe, is SysML, Systems Modeling Language, and others. David, I have a direct question for you. Actually, I have two direct questions, if I may.
Please.
The scope is clearly defined in terms of intended versus unintended consequences of creating sustained system change. The examples that were mentioned, the lily pond and the iceberg, are very good symbolic examples. But when we say complex social systems, I believe we need to incorporate human and societal relationships and changes being different than material changes. So what's your take on how to include actually human and societal change? Because that's really different than material change. And in that respect, in terms of real life, there is always resource constraints. So we may have the best strategy to deal with the creative tension, but we don't have the resources to do so. So I would like your feedback on maybe more applied projects that were implemented in a developing country context, such as Egypt or other countries that had some resource constraints and that have a more of a people-centric vision for change.
Sure. Well, first of all, Tarek, I very much agree with you that any endeavor usually has resource constraints in the real world. And that will be true in developing countries. In my experience, it's also true in developed countries. In terms of examples that include human beings, because I focused here on the climate change and just the natural world, there are 10 cases in my book. One of the ones that I refer to a lot is ending homelessness in an area of about 100,000 people in the center of the United States. And we had stakeholders from the public sector, from the social sector, and from the private sector involved. And what they learned, and we also had homeless people directly involved in the planning process. And what we learned and what the stakeholders learned is that even though homeless shelters are the obvious way to deal with the problem, and the way the community and many communities have tried to deal with the problem, it actually makes it harder. It takes resources away from implementing the more fundamental solution, which is to provide some kind of permanent, affordable housing for homeless people. Because in providing that permanent housing, you actually reduce many of the social costs associated with treating homeless people. Social costs associated with mental illness, with drug abuse, with people simply going to emergency rooms in hospitals for healthcare, or ending up in the jails overnight. There's enormous benefits to be had from building this permanent, affordable housing. But notice, and this is an issue also where you talk about resource constraint, if you invest, and most systems invest in the quick fixes, in the obvious solutions like shelters. So if the argument becomes, well, should we build another shelter, or should we build this permanent housing? Sort of the obvious solution is, well, let's build the shelters. They're easier to build. We can get more people housed more quickly, at least on a temporary basis. So people naturally gravitate toward directing those limited resources to the quick fixes, and then wonder why they don't have enough resources to implement the more fundamental, sustainable solutions. And this community recognized that difference as a result of doing this work, and invested a lot more in making this permanent housing available.
Great, thank you, David. I would like to share a couple of questions from the chat, and then maybe if we have some time to open for questions from the audience. So in the chat box, there is a question about what's the difference between systems thinking and design thinking?
Good question. So systems thinking to me is big picture thinking. It says, where in this larger system should we really focus our attention? What part of the system? And then once we identify what part of the system to focus on and why, how do we actually engage that part of the system in more detail? That's where design thinking can be very, very effective. Because if we, let's say, understand that the leverage exists with the housing developers, then we can use design thinking to help the housing developers be more motivated to develop this kind of housing, which they normally associate with very low profitability. So we can use design thinking once we identify that it's in fact the constraint around affordable housing, and in part the developer's motivation to build that housing, that really has to be addressed in greater detail.
All right, thank you. I have two questions. I'll try to group a couple of questions or comments actually. Some are mentioning causal effects or root causes. That's difference between normal causes and root causes. And if we address the root causes with the gap analysis, that's the 4-step analysis, basically gap analysis, having it with a creative tension and accelerating to reduce the gap. How can we incorporate root causes with the gap analysis in your 4-stage model?
Well, there are certain systemic patterns or structures that we call system archetypes that illuminate these different factors. For example, there's a dynamic called shifting the burden, where we shift the burden for change from implementing a longer-term, more fundamental solution to implementing a quick fix. The fundamental solution would address the underlying root cause, but it would take longer to implement. The quick fix, on the other hand, addresses symptoms, but it's easier to implement. It's a faster way, at least in the short term, to reduce the discrepancy or to reduce the gap. When we understand this dynamic, we also recognize that the more we depend on the quick fix over time, actually undermine our ability to address the root cause of the problem and achieve a more sustainable change. There is a trade-off between those two, and when we make that trade-off very explicit, it's easier for people to consider whether they want to address the root cause or continue to address the symptom.
All right. I have 3 questions. I'll try to group them in the chat, and then we have a couple of minutes. Maybe we can have 1 or 2 questions from the audience directly. So I'll try to group the chat questions. Actually a lot of questions around the application of the model in terms of emergency timing and uncertainty timings, such as application of the COVID, moving from shift of education to online learning, and also in terms of uncertainty, where we have young entrepreneurs trying to adopt systems thinking during turbulent times. And also climate change as an application of the model. So we have education, climate change, and entrepreneurship as three applications that were asked in the audience. I'll get your feedback on that.
Oh boy. I'll say two things. One is, in doing this work, it helps to start with a focusing question. And the focusing question, so that it helps us understand the bottom of the iceberg, where we have the greatest leverage, is to start by asking a question that begins with why. Why, often despite our best efforts, have we been unable to achieve a particular goal or solve a particular problem? So even if you're an entrepreneur, you're trying to innovate in a space often where people have tried to do something so far and not been able to do it, not been able to be as effective. And if you don't want to make the same mistakes that other people have made, it really helps to have a deeper understanding of why the problem has persisted despite other efforts to solve it. And this would be true for any of the spaces that you move into. In terms of uncertainty, any work you do in this space is a hypothesis. It's not an answer, it's not a final answer, in part because the system usually is, again, it's too complex to understand and simply fix all of it. And secondly, because conditions change. Uncertainty is a fact of life, and increasingly so. So we need to build in the mindset and the capacity for continuous learning, even as we develop shared hypotheses about what the nature of the underlying problem is and what we think we should be doing to address it. So it's both achieving greater clarity about what we could do on the one hand, and always being humble and curious and open to the extent to which we really understand what's going on, and to the fact that conditions will change.
I think we have time for maybe a couple of questions from the audience that have been asked. David, if you can please stop sharing the screen. Okay, Mu'taz Darwish, please, would you like to ask your question directly? You raise your hand, Mu'taz Darwish. Can you?
Yes, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you for the informative session. So I actually have multiple questions, so I'll focus on one just for the sake of time. What is the role of behaviors in the iceberg or in the system thinking in general? Is it a deeper level of system in the iceberg, or is it part of the systemic structural issues? And in mind, I'm thinking behavioral economics, behavioral strategy as a backdrop literature.
Economic behavior, you're saying, as an example?
Behavioral economics and behavioral strategy. So literally behaviors of people, whether managers or economic actors.
Okay. I think that the behaviors themselves are likely to appear as trends or patterns. Why those behaviors exist is more the question of system structure. What are the costs and reward systems? What are the motivational systems? To what extent are people motivated simply by reason? To what extent are they motivated by what we understand in behavioral dynamics about psychology? People's beliefs, their underlying assumptions or mental models, all of those are at the structural level. So the behavior,
I would like to
patterns.
To mention just a quick thing, David, that in behavioral structural diagrams as well, there is a behavioral relationship diagrams, you know, in this system model
Right.
algorithms. So so there's a difference between behavioral relationships and resource relationships and the system architecture itself. And definitely, and I think from a behavioral economics point of view, if I may follow up on what Mu'taz was asking, is the issue of rationality and maybe sometimes irrationality, and how people may not be always logical, always rational, because there are, as you mentioned, sometimes quick fixes give high rewards that may not lead to long-term efficiency gains. So what do you think about that?
I think it's very important, absolutely. And I think that what we find in neuroscience and behavioral economics is very consistent with how we understand the way social systems behave. For example, that tendency to be drawn to the quick fix with somehow the hope or the assumption that if we can be successful in the short term, we'll also be successful in the long term. So yes, I think compatibility.
Well, thank you. I just want to ask the audience if it's okay to maybe we'll have 10 more minutes because it seems there are a lot of questions there. Maybe 5 or 7 more minutes for an extended time. Yeah. Just a feedback on the quick fixes, and this is where politics comes into play, and usually due to political uncertainties, and quick fixes are more popular in a political point of view rather than long-term, 10-15 years. So in 1 or 2 years is much better politically speaking, politically correct speaking. So what's your take on the influence of politics to have the solutions more of a short term rather than long term?
I think that there needs to be a lot of political pressure applied from the grassroots, from the communities, from the voters, whatever the structures are that influence power flowing upward and pushing upward, because usually people who are in positions of power and want to maintain control are going to be thinking in terms of their own short-term interests. And they're not necessarily going to be willing to give that up freely. So although the work that I do is largely building greater cooperation and collaboration, there is also a place for strong advocacy for political movements and approaches like that.
Okay, as a follow-up, I mean, a country like Egypt where you have millions of problems and, you can't wait to the long term to solve these problems. So actually, sometimes quick fixes in the short term may have positive consequences as well, not only politically, but even economically, because if you can't wait, like, for example, homelessness and, other things that may have a quick fix may have also some short-term gains as well. So what's your take on that?
I think that the important thing is to recognize that systems thinking does not say focus on the long term and ignore the short term. That is not the message. The message is that when you focus on the short term, always keep the long term in mind. You need short-term successes. We need short-term successes to maintain motivation, to get more funding. And there are plenty of reasons we need short-term successes. We're not saying ignore them, but we are saying pick those short-term successes that you aim for with an understanding of how it is going to build toward the long-term outcomes that you want. Because if you don't think in those terms, you will actually discover that what you did in the short term makes it harder to get where you want to go in the long term, not easier. So I talk about the difference between a short-term success, which is important, and a quick fix, which is usually damaging.
All right, Mustafa Sharif, you can ask your question directly if you want. Mustafa Sharif.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, sir, for this webinar. I really benefited a lot. So to get directly into the question, my friends and I, they're my teammates actually, we're doing a project on transforming informal communities in Egypt to be environmental vantage points to fight climate change. So we know that that the informal sector is very rich in many ways. And so I just wanted to know your point of view. It's a massive issue and it has to do with community development. And so there are many, many factors at play. How can we, or what can we do to start? A good way to start. I understand that asking a question that starts with why and thinking of the root issues is important, but I wanted to know your point of view.
A great question, and I think it builds very well on what I just said. A lot of short-term successes in systems work are in changing relationships and building capacity, not in necessarily achieving dramatic, immediate outcomes. So the work you're doing at the community level is, as I would understand it, assume it to be, it's about building new relationships and it's about building new capacities for action. Here, a long-term former colleague of mine in the United States developed something called the 5,000 pound, the low carbon diet is what he called it, the low carbon diet. And it is a workbook that neighborhood groups can work from together to understand what are their ecological footprints, what are their carbon footprints, and what can each household do, literally each household, to reduce that carbon footprint. Could they buy a washing machine that they share? Could they buy lawn equipment that they share? Could they commit to reducing their driving habits? I mean, some of these now are being affected by the pandemic, but it's literally working at the neighborhood level to begin to make these kinds of changes. So I think you're definitely on the right track.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. We have actually our last question, Ali El Nadi.
Yes, hi. Thank you very much for this very informative webinar. And I had I think it's a big question, really. It's not, I tried to frame it because I think on the very philosophical level, this is radical work because, you're moving away from the Newtonian, thought, you're moving away from predictability and, that kind of thing. So the question is really, how do you translate that into a project management perspective? Because in other words, how far do you need to go to actually understand how a system functions? Because, I mean, we were talking right now about the long term. So, and at the same time, we're talking about nonlinearity and unpredictability. So how do you actually put that, how do you codify that,
Well, I think that you get as many of the stakeholders together as you can to understand the nature of the system they're trying to change, where the root causes are, where the leverage points are, what a systemic theory of change might look like. That's all the long-term focus. And then literally identify how do you sequence these changes so that you do what is most politically acceptable first and most likely to show some kind of gain, because you're always thinking in terms of what is implementable. You have to. But you're now doing it within this longer term context, and you do action planning. What is a short-term project that we can build on, that people can look to? Maybe it's a demonstration project of some kind. Maybe it's showing off a new set of connections between stakeholders that never talked to each other before. So there's definitely a place for very grounded accountabilities, project plans, measurable deliverables within the short term. Again, all of that work is very important, but most effective when done first within this longer term context that people take a certain amount of time to develop.
Thank you.
And it doesn't need to be a long period of time. It can be a period of months to engage a group of stakeholders, and depending on the number, and get them moving in a long-term direction together.
So you would say that, you know, coordination and collaboration would be, to an extent, the first step to actually, you know.
Yes, and building the capacities to make that happen. Yes.
Thank you very much.
So if I may add, also from a project management perspective, I think the time scheduling is very, very important. You know, budgeting and scheduling are the most two critical pillars of project management. So when we talk about action tasks, I think having a strategy, or as David mentioned, you must have success stories in the short term, having in mind the long-term vision. But also when you apply the strategies in the project management in particular, I believe in a country like Egypt, there are immediate solutions. Don't even have to wait in the short term. There are immediate solutions. And there are short-term solutions within a year or so, 6 months or a year. And then there are medium-term and long-term impacts and solutions. So I think having this from a project management point of view on a time scale, immediate, short-term and medium, long-term, I think for different tasks in terms of scheduling, in terms of budgeting, would be, I think, would be interesting to do as well. One last question, and then we'll finish. I know we're out of time, but the talk is very interesting, David. Do you think systems literature has been stagnant, not widely adopted since the early 1990s? And if yes, why?
Wow. I think the challenge with systems literature is the difference between the writing about how systems behave, and the writing about how to apply the insights in practical ways. System dynamics, which is the educational academic foundation for systems thinking, which is the qualitative work, has been around since the 1960s. It's what is typically taught in universities, is system dynamics modeling. System dynamics modeling, of course, can be more precise than a qualitative model. The risk with system dynamics modeling is that it doesn't as effectively engage the users in developing their own insights, because the models have to be built by experts. So we have found the qualitative approach of systems thinking to be very helpful. And even in the Fifth Discipline and the Fifth Discipline Field Book, and I worked with Peter Senge for years in this work. He provides wonderful principles and tools like the iceberg and archetypes but I don't know that there's been as much work done on how do you actually integrate those principles and tools into a change management process. And that was the goal of my book. And many people have said that it's been a very helpful framework for them. But interestingly, even to this day, I don't know that there are academic degrees granted in systems thinking. They're usually granted in system dynamics, which is the more quantitative approach. How can systems thinking as a methodology be used by educators and also benefit their students? I think that the qualitative approaches are just going to be more understandable and accessible to everyone except, the highest level decision makers who are trying to figure out where to spend millions of dollars and need quantitative precision in their decision making, and are willing to live with the insights that a model could produce. And that's always the key. You're not only building insight, but you have to build ownership. And ownership is the political work and the social political work.
All right, thank you very much. If I may also, I think MBSE is a kind of a three-layer interface, qualitative, quantitative, and relationships. It's based on the MIT systems architecture. So that's pretty recent. It's actually started in the 2000s. Its roots were in the 60s, but with the new artificial intelligence and the systems modeling and so forth, it has a big qualitative component as well. So it's a mesh between qualitative, quantitative, and relationships. I strongly recommend to consult the MBSE systems model that's been more recently changed towards more qualitative. So maybe this could also answer the previous question, but we are out of time. I'm sorry for everyone. Thank you all, and thank you, David. David Stroh has been instrumental in today's webinar. Talked about systems thinking for social change. I'm sure you have lots of, and we all learned a lot from you, David. So thank you very much for being part of Gerhard series webinar series. And thank you, David. And just as a reminder, before we close, we'll have this Wednesday, in a couple of days, same time, 7 p.m., Wednesday, February 9th, we'll have systems work of social change, how to harness connection, context, and power to cultivate deep and enduring change, as Gerhard Center webinar series by Cynthia Rayner, affiliated with the Berthia Center for Social Innovation at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. So that would be also an interesting dimension of systems thinking and systems work for social change. So thank you all. Thank you, David. We really appreciate you being with us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. Good luck.